Welcome to this edition of Meet the Candidates. I'm David Nicholas, and our guest this time is Scotty Boman. He is the Libertarian candidate for this year's U.S. Senate race. Thank you very much for joining us. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
We call it Meet the Candidates, so we like to start with a little bit of biographical background in our first minute or so. Tell us a little bit about your background, hometown, and experience that you're bringing to the race.
Okay, well, I'm born and raised in Detroit. I've lived in Michigan all my life. I went to school in Detroit, went to Detroit Waldorf School as a young person, went to Grosse Pointe South High School. For college, went over to Western Michigan University, where I got my undergraduate in physics and philosophy. Those are two majors with a minor in math. And then also got my master's in physics at Western Michigan University. Went into getting an education degree at Wayne State University, where I got my master's in teaching both physics and math. I currently am a college professor where I teach at Wayne State. I taught at Wayne State University in astronomy class last summer, but I also on a regular basis teach at Wayne Community College District, physics and math, and I teach astronomy at Macomb Community College. I've been involved with the Libertarian Party basically since about 1988, though I was basically thinking Libertarian probably 5 years before that. I have run for office at a variety of posts, most recently for Lieutenant Governor, alongside Gregory Creswell, who ran for governor, and I have been chair of the Libertarian Party. So I've been involved in the Libertarian movement for quite a while.
As a race for the seat in the U.S. Senate that is up this year, challenging the incumbent Senator Carl Levin, obviously, clearly, it's a blend between issues impacting both the nation and the state. What do you identify as those major issues for the election this year?
Well, I'm identifying with issues that you're not going to hear a lot about as far as what the major parties, the Republicans and Democrats, really want to talk about. I'm trying to bring other issues to the table. One of those issues is the Patriot Act and what I consider to be a severe assault on the civil liberties of Americans as a consequence of the Patriot Act. The Supreme Court, fortunately, has restored habeas corpus for now, but we still have issues involving secret trials, secret tribunals. We have the prison in Guantanamo where torture is permitted. There is the federal government listening in on our phone conversations and reading our emails. And though I do admit my opponent voted the right way this last time around, in the past he hasn't voted that way. He's voted with removing a lot of our privacies. And I think that's really, to me, the core issue is liberty and privacy, not new liberty or privacy that I want to see beyond what I grew up with just returning to the liberty and privacy we had just a few years ago.
You mentioned that as a specific issue in general as a challenger in this race. When it comes to issues either of national security or domestic policy, how would you differentiate yourself and what approach would you want to bring as a different approach as a challenger in this race to what we have seen with the incumbent candidate?
I would like to see an end to secret trials. I'd like to see the cessation of any torture at Guantanamo, or there's other like loopholes they use where they try to export prisoners to other countries and then they do the torturing. I'd like to see an end to that. I'd like to see an end to warrantless wiretaps. I do not believe in granting immunity to telecommunications companies that currently are basically that illegally, and even though the Patriot Act made significant intrusions legal, still illegally perform surveillance on people's emails and phone calls. Those companies can't be sued now under the law, and I'd like to repeal it so they could be sued for the crimes they committed. Those are some major things I'd like to see happen. And then also getting troops out of Iraq as soon as possible. I don't believe we need to keep them there any longer, and the government of Iraq themselves, who supposedly our government says we need to now protect and keep up, basically their own president wants the United States out of there. So it's not a matter of simply keeping up with what we promised to do, even though it was wrong to go there. Now the country that we're supposedly propping up doesn't want us there either. So there's really no more reason to stay. And of course, the reason going in there was ridiculous anyhow, because we went in there based upon this assumption of weapons of mass destruction that were never found. I wouldn't be shocked if a similar scenario plays its role out in Iran. I don't think this is what our country should be doing. We should be protecting our own borders and ensuring security at home, but not trying to build an empire globally by creating false causes for attack.
So when it comes to issues of foreign policy in general, and you mentioned Iraq, you mentioned the potential further involvement in Iran, consistent then with the overall philosophy and stated goals of the Libertarian Party in general that you are now following as a candidate for this U.S. Senate seat?
Yeah, and one thing I do want to distinguish here is there are people in the Libertarian Party in Michigan, for instance, who may feel they want less government on the domestic level but are more hawkish than I on the foreign policy issues. But the National Party, our National Party platform, has been pretty much non-interventionist all the way along. But of course, we're not necessarily totally monolithic on these views. And while I'm adding this, it's not only the current in the news topic of Iraq and our occupation there, but also the general presence of our military abroad as being essentially the occupier of so many countries, or simply having bases in countries where essentially we stay out of the way, but we have bases all over the world that are costing taxpayers trillions of dollars. The European Union is fully capable of defending itself against Russia. They have the resources. If they haven't built up enough weaponry to be balanced, they easily could. They're advanced countries. They don't need us there. The Japanese, they're fully capable of building up a sufficient defense for themselves. We don't need to have bases in Japan. Korea, South Korea, sure, they have a crazy neighbor to the north, but they're a modern country too. They're an economic competitor. They're doing great because we're subsidizing their economy by providing them with a defense. Once again, they should be able to take care of themselves. We don't need to be a global empire.
And that is some of the blend that brings us from the international and the foreign policies to the crossover to some of the domestic issues. Our guest here on Meet the Candidates is Scotty Boman. He is the Libertarian candidate for the U.S. Senate. When we look then, and you mentioned some of those foreign policy concerns, such as the Patriot Act and the base in Cuba and so forth, pulling that in a little bit closer to look at the relations economically and so forth with other countries and how it relates then to U.S. domestic policy. What are your views and how would you differ yourself from the other candidates that you're challenging in this race?
Well, I also wouldn't be for propping up foreign economies, not only in the area of military aid, but in general sending money abroad, foreign aid. For instance, in the Middle East, like we got all these loans we send to Israel, and then afterward, they say, well, we're not giving money out, we're just loaning it, but then the loans are forgiven. And it's basically a handout. The taxpayers of this country are suffering enough as it is that to sit there and fund other countries and support foreign economies is just not something that is sustainable anymore. In addition to it, I think being a bad idea and making enemies, that whichever country we happen to be helping out on a given day, if they do something that offends another country, suddenly the U.S. ends up getting all the blame because people are like, well, you are paying for this country to do this or that. So it creates animosity among our neighbors, where if you look at the alternatives, such as the role Switzerland has played, for instance, they're a secure country. They're not isolated. In fact, they interact quite well on the financial realm with the rest of the world, but they don't have an interventionist foreign policy. They have a foreign policy that keeps them out of other countries' military affairs as a neutral country. And I think we could do much better maybe accepting some aspects of the Swiss model as far as foreign policy goes.
How would we adapt that then, or come up with a different approach than what you have seen from the incumbent and perhaps some of the other views you've heard from the challengers in this race when it comes specifically to domestic policy, whether it be economics here at home, the national economy, and how national economics have played a role in impacting the economy in Michigan specifically, or issues such as education and the like. What are your views there?
Okay, well, it's a very good question because, and I guess maybe the theme here is a lack of intervention, but for different reasons here. Now I'm speaking more specifically about the constitutional limitations on the federal government, that aside from the fact that I as a libertarian support less government intervention at all levels, there is a constitutional limit on the appropriate interventional role of the federal government into state affairs. And the Constitution does not give the federal government the authority to regulate intrastate commerce, only the authority to regulate interstate commerce. And what we have right now is a federal government that does involve itself in the economies of the states. And I would, one thing, just like to see them stay out of intrastate commerce as far as trying to regulate business at the state level. Leave that to the states. And then I would suggest to the state governments, as a libertarian, that they also allow more free market within their own boundaries. But it's got to start by getting the federal government out of having an intrusive role. It also means getting, I also believe in repealing the income tax. I realize that the Constitution has been amended to allow for that, so I can't say it's unconstitutional. But what I will say is the income tax has had a destructive effect on our economy. I've never heard anyone really argue successfully that high taxes are good for trade and business or personal finances. The income tax should be repealed. Now, as far as how do we pay for other things, well, basically the only money that we've had as far as increased spending since the year 2000, basically that amount of money, if we went back to 2000 spending levels, in other words, the amount of money we'd have left in the absence of the income tax would cover the remaining expenses. So I don't really see a need to continue an income tax. I'm not for the fair tax, unlike some other libertarians have come out in favor of that, because I believe what would end up happening, and I saw this happen in Michigan with one of the proposal A's we had a few years back, is essentially we'd have the promise of having one tax permanently rolled back, get this other tax brought in, and then end up probably with both taxes.
In about the last 30 seconds that we have to sum up your beliefs and your positions, and what would be the message you would leave with the voters as they get set to go to the polls in asking for their vote?
Well, one thing I would say is if you disapprove of the fact that your Senator, Carl Levin, has voted to spend your tax dollars to help bail out wealthy Wall Street investors and bankers, then I suggest voting for Scotty Boman, because that'll send a clear message that you're voting for somebody who thinks differently and that you're not happy bailing out these Wall Street investment firms and bankers. Also, another thing I would suggest is think about the fact that normally you may have been hesitant to vote for a third-party candidate because it was a close race and you were afraid the worst candidate would win. But this time around, there's like a 15% lead of Carl Levin over the Republican challenger. So you already know he's going to win, but at least don't make his victory quite so sweet. Make him shake a little and vote for an alternative, Scotty Boman, who believes in keeping your money in your wallet and letting you manage your own personal life. And if you want to know more, visit Scotty Boman's webpage at bowman08.com. That's BOMAN08.com.
Well, thanks very much for joining us, taking the time to be here. We do appreciate it. And thank you for joining us as well here on Meet the Candidates. Our guest has been Scotty Boman, Libertarian candidate for the U.S. Senate. I'm David Nicholas. We encourage all of you to go out and exercise your right to vote on November 4th. Thanks for your time.